Nobody on Flight 847 noticed the young woman in seat 23C until she saved all their lives. Fallon Martinez appeared to be just another passenger, number 127 on the manifest, reading a book and sipping coffee as the Boeing 707 cruised at 35,000 feet over the Atlantic. But when disaster struck and the pilots were incapacitated, the F-22 Raptor escorts flanking their aircraft would learn why the call sign Phoenix had once been whispered with reverence in military command centers across 3 continents. The morning sun painted the cabin of British Airways Flight 847 in warm golden hues as it began its descent toward London Heathrow. It was supposed to be a routine transatlantic crossing, the kind of flight that happened hundreds of times daily, carrying business travelers, tourists, and families across the ocean without incident. The Boeing 707-200 had departed John F. Kennedy International Airport right on schedule, its 284 passengers settling into the familiar rhythm of long-haul travel. In the cockpit, Captain Michael Harrison and First Officer Sarah Chone were conducting their standard pre-descent procedures. Harrison, a 23-year veteran with British Airways, had flown this route more than 1,000 times. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, minimal turbulence, with London reporting sunny conditions and light winds. It was the kind of day that made flying feel routine, almost mundane. The passenger manifest showed the usual mix of international travelers. Business executives in first class worked on their laptop, preparing for Monday morning meetings. Families in economy wrestled with restless children who'd grown tired of the 8-hour journey. Students backpacking their way across continents slept against windows or watched downloaded movies on their phones. Nobody paid particular attention to passenger 127, listed simply as F. Martinez, seated in 23C. The young woman appeared to be in her mid-20s, with a kind of understated presence that made her blend seamlessly into any crowd. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes, jeans, a plain sweater, and comfortable sneakers. Nothing about her suggested military service or aviation experience. Throughout the flight, Fallon had been the perfect passenger. She'd politely declined the meal service, read quietly from a worn paperback novel, and caused no disturbance to her fellow travelers. The flight attendants had barely noticed her, except to offer the standard service, which she'd accepted with a quiet "thank you" spoken in lightly accented English that suggested European origins. What nobody realized was that Fallon's eyes had been tracking far more than the pages of her book. Every 30 minutes she'd glanced at her watch, not from impatience, but from habit. She'd noted the flight attendants' locations during their service routines, observed the behavior of nervous flyers, and unconsciously cataloged the aircraft's sounds and movements. These weren't the observations of an anxious passenger, but the automatic threat assessment patterns of someone trained to notice everything. The book in her hands, a collection of poetry by Pablo Neruda, was dog-eared and heavily annotated, suggesting it had been read many times. But between the romantic verses were subtle notes written in 3 different languages, coded reminders that would mean nothing to a casual observer, but everything to someone who understood operational security protocols. As Flight 847 began its descent, air traffic control at London Heathrow was coordinating the morning rush of incoming international flights. The controllers were experienced professionals, managing the complex dance of aircraft approaching one of the world's busiest airports. Everything was proceeding normally until Heathrow Control received an unusual transmission from RAF Coningsby. 2 F-22 Raptor fighter jets had been scrambled in what was initially described as a routine training exercise. The Raptors, part of a joint NATO training program, were conducting intercept drills with commercial aircraft, a standard procedure designed to test response times and communication protocols. Flight 847 had been selected as the practice target, a common occurrence that most passengers never even noticed. The lead Raptor pilot, Squadron Leader James Morrison, was a decorated RAF officer with over 2,000 hours in fighter aircraft. His wingman, Flight Lieutenant Rebecca Torres, was one of the youngest pilots ever qualified to fly the F-22. Both were elite aviators, the kind who lived and breathed military precision. As they approached Flight 847's position, Morrison's radio crackled with routine communications from air traffic control. The exercise was proceeding normally, with the commercial aircraft maintaining course and altitude while the fighters performed their intercept protocols. It was supposed to be a textbook training mission, the kind that would be logged and forgotten by evening. But sometimes routine flights become anything but routine. Sometimes the most ordinary circumstances reveal the most extraordinary people. And sometimes passenger 127 becomes something much more significant than anyone could have imagined. In seat 23C, Fallon Martinez closed her book and looked out the window at the English countryside spreading below. She checked her watch one more time, noting their position and altitude with the precision of someone who understood exactly where they were and where they needed to be. She had no idea that in approximately 12 minutes, everything would change. Fallon Martinez had learned long ago that being underestimated was often an advantage. At 5'4" tall with a slight build and quiet demeanor, she possessed the rare gift of invisibility in crowds. Throughout her life, people had looked at her and seen exactly what they expected to see, a young woman who appeared unremarkable in every conventional sense. Her fellow passengers on Flight 847 saw her as they saw dozens of other travelers. Forgettable. The businessman in 23A had glanced at her once when settling into a seat, dismissing her as probably a student or perhaps a young professional on vacation. The elderly couple in 23D and 23E had offered polite smiles when she'd helped the woman stow her carry-on bag, noting her helpfulness but thinking nothing more of it. Even the flight crew treated her as part of the background. Flight attendant Marcus Webb had served her coffee with professional courtesy, but his attention was focused on the more demanding passengers. The executive who requested 3 different newspapers, the mother struggling with twin toddlers in row 18, the man in first class who complained about the temperature twice. What none of them could see was the person beneath the unremarkable exterior. Fallon's quiet confidence wasn't shyness. It was the controlled awareness of someone trained to observe rather than be observed. Her steady hands weren't just calm. They were hands that had operated complex systems under extreme pressure. Her alert eyes weren't merely intelligent. They were eyes that had seen combat and learned to read situations others couldn't comprehend. Born in Barcelona to a Spanish mother and American father, Fallon had grown up bilingual and bicultural, moving between worlds with an adaptability that would later prove invaluable. Her childhood had been unremarkable by most standards: good grades, a few close friends, and a love of aviation sparked by visits to her grandfather, a retired Iberia Airlines pilot who'd filled her head with stories of flight. At 18, she surprised everyone by enrolling in the Spanish Air Force Academy. Her family had expected her to pursue journalism or international relations, fields that seemed to match her linguistic abilities and quiet intelligence. Instead, she'd chosen a path that would transform her from an unassuming young woman into one of the most skilled combat pilots in NATO. The Spanish Air Force had initially shared her family's doubts. Flight training was demanding, both physically and mentally, with a dropout rate that eliminated most candidates before they ever reached advanced aircraft. Fallon's instructors had looked at her during those first weeks and wondered if she had the presence, the commanding personality they associated with military aviation. They'd been wrong about almost everything. While her classmates relied on aggression and bravado, Fallon succeeded through precision and intelligence. She'd outflown candidates who were taller, stronger, and louder, earning her wings through sheer skill and determination. Her flight instructors had noted that she possessed an almost supernatural awareness of aircraft systems, weather conditions, and tactical situations. But it was her performance during a training emergency that first earned her real respect. When a mechanical failure had put her aircraft and her instructor at risk, Fallon had executed a perfect emergency landing under conditions that had grounded more experienced pilots. Her debrief had been a masterclass in crisis management, delivered in the same quiet voice that had once made her instructors doubt her potential. After earning her commission, Fallon had been selected for NATO's elite exchange program, flying missions across Europe and the Mediterranean. She'd piloted everything from transport aircraft to fighter jets, accumulating flight hours and commendations that would have made pilots twice her age envious. Her call sign, Phoenix, had been earned during a classified operation where she'd successfully completed a mission after her aircraft had been severely damaged. Yet despite her achievements, Fallon had never lost the ability to blend into civilian environments. Military colleagues who'd seen her in combat situations often failed to recognize her in regular clothes. It was a skill she'd cultivated deliberately, understanding that sometimes the most effective operators were those who could disappear into the background when necessary. Now at 26, she was on leave from active duty, taking what she described to her family as a sabbatical to decide her future. The truth was more complex. Recent missions had left her questioning aspects of military life, and she was considering transitioning to civilian aviation, perhaps following her grandfather's footsteps into commercial flying. This flight to London was part of that exploration. She had meetings scheduled with several European airlines, interviews that might determine whether her future lay in military service or civilian aviation. It was a crossroads moment, the kind she'd approached with her characteristic methodical planning. What she hadn't planned for was the possibility that her two worlds, military and civilian, would collide at 35,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. As Flight 847 continued its descent toward London, Fallon remained just another passenger. Her extraordinary background, hidden beneath layers of intentional ordinariness. Throughout her civilian transition, Fallon had grown accustomed to a different kind of dismissal than what she'd faced in military training. In the Air Force, doubts about her capabilities had been direct and measurable. Could she handle the G-forces? Could she master complex aircraft systems? Could she make split-second tactical decisions under fire? Once she'd proven herself, respect had followed, even if grudgingly. But in civilian aviation, the exclusion was more subtle and somehow more frustrating. During her preliminary interviews with European airlines over the past month, she'd encountered a pattern of polite interest followed by gentle redirection. Her military credentials were impressive, the recruiters acknowledged, but perhaps she might consider starting in a training role, or maybe regional flights would be a better fit for someone transitioning from military service. The subtext was always the same. She looked too young, too small, too soft for the commanding presence they associated with commercial aviation captains. Never mind that she'd logged over 3,000 flight hours in aircraft far more complex than any civilian jetliner. Never mind that she'd successfully completed missions in weather conditions that would ground commercial flights for days. At Lufthansa's Munich headquarters, the chief pilot had spent most of their meeting explaining how different civilian flying was from military operations. "It's about passenger confidence," he'd said, leaning back in his leather chair. "People want to see someone who looks like they can handle any situation. Someone with presence." His eyes had lingered on her small frame as he spoke, making his meaning clear without saying it directly. British Airways had been more diplomatic, but equally dismissive. The interview had gone well until the final panel, where she'd been asked about her long-term career goals in a tone that suggested they were already planning to offer her a position she wouldn't want. When she'd mentioned her interest in flying wide-body aircraft on international routes, the silence had stretched uncomfortably long. "Perhaps we should start you on our domestic routes," the senior captain had finally suggested. "You could gain valuable experience with passenger service while you adapt to civilian procedures." He'd smiled as he said it, the kind of smile meant to soften what felt like a demotion for someone who'd piloted fighter jets over hostile territory. Even her own family had unknowingly contributed to the pattern. When she told her parents about her career transition, her father had immediately suggested she consider becoming a flight instructor instead of pursuing airline work. "It would be less stressful," he'd said, meaning well but missing the point entirely, "and you'd still be around aviation without all the pressure of commercial flying." Her mother had been more direct. "Are you sure you want to compete with all those men for captain positions? Maybe there's something else in aviation that would suit you better." The words had stung because they came from love, but they reflected the same assumptions she'd been fighting her entire career. The most painful exclusion had come from her former military colleagues. At a NATO reunion in Brussels 2 months earlier, she'd mentioned her civilian transition to a group of pilots she'd served with on multiple deployments. The response had been a mixture of surprise and barely concealed condescension. "Commercial aviation is a completely different world," Major Stevens had said, the same Stevens who'd once relied on her navigation skills to complete a critical resupply mission. "Military flying is about following orders and completing objectives. Civilian flying is about customer service and dealing with bureaucracy. Are you sure you want to deal with all that?" The implication was clear. She was somehow suited for military precision, but not civilian leadership. It was as if her colleagues couldn't imagine her transitioning from taking orders to making command decisions, despite having watched her do exactly that under combat conditions. Flight Lieutenant Chun, who'd been her wingman on several missions, had been more blunt. Why not try cargo operations first? Work your way up gradually. Passenger airlines can be pretty demanding about their captains having a certain image. Even the recruitment agencies had been frustrating. They'd praised her qualifications enthusiastically over the phone, then seemed deflated when they met her in person. One recruiter had actually suggested she consider becoming a flight attendant first to learn the passenger service side of aviation before pursuing pilot positions. The pattern was always the same: initial interest based on her credentials, followed by surprise at her appearance, then subtle suggestions that she might be better suited for something smaller, something less visible, something that didn't require the kind of commanding presence they associated with aviation leadership. What made it particularly galling was that she knew she could outfly most of the commercial pilots who'd been offered positions she was being denied. She'd handled aircraft in conditions that would terrify airline pilots, had made life and death decisions while managing complex tactical situations, had earned commendations for performance under pressure that most civilian pilots would never face. But none of that mattered when recruiters looked at her and saw someone who might make passengers nervous, someone who didn't fit their image of what an airline captain should look like. The skills that had made her exceptional in military aviation, precision over showmanship, intelligence over intimidation, competence over commanding physical presence, were being treated as deficiencies in a civilian context. As Flight 847 continued its descent toward London, Fallon reflected on the interview she had scheduled for the following morning. Another airline, another panel of recruiters who would probably offer her another position that fell short of her qualifications and experience. She'd begun to wonder if civilian aviation was ready for someone like her, or if she should return to military service, where her capabilities were understood and valued. She had no way of knowing that in 8 minutes, the question of her suitability for civilian aviation leadership would be answered definitively in front of witnesses who would never again doubt what someone her size could accomplish at the controls of an aircraft in crisis. While airlines questioned her readiness for civilian aviation, Fallon had spent every free moment of her transition period preparing for challenges they couldn't imagine. Her approach to career change was the same methodical thoroughness that had made her exceptional in military service. Identify every possible scenario, master every relevant skill, and be ready for opportunities that others might miss. Her London flat, rented for the duration of her job interviews, looked like a civilian apartment, but functioned like a personal training facility. Technical manuals for every major commercial aircraft type filled her bookshelves: Boeing 777, Airbus A350, 787 Dreamliner, each one annotated with notes written in her precise handwriting. She'd memorized emergency procedures for aircraft she'd never officially flown, studied weather patterns for routes she'd never been assigned, and analyzed accident reports to understand failure modes that airline training might not cover comprehensively. Every evening after interviews, while other candidates for airline positions were networking at hotel bars or relaxing in their rooms, Fallon was in her flat working through complex scenario training on aviation simulation software she'd acquired through military contacts. The programs were more advanced than what most airlines use for training, designed for combat situations, but adaptable to civilian emergencies. She'd practiced engine failures during takeoff, multiple system malfunctions at altitude, and weather-related emergencies in every type of commercial aircraft. Her simulation log showed hundreds of hours spent mastering scenarios that airline pilots might encounter once in an entire career, if ever. But Fallon approached preparation the way she'd approached military readiness: hope for the best, train for the worst. Her language skills had also been sharpened with purpose. Already fluent in Spanish and English, she'd added conversational proficiency in French, German, and Italian during her transition period. Aviation was international, and she'd seen too many emergency situations complicated by communication barriers. If she was going to fly commercially, she wanted to be able to communicate clearly with air traffic control and emergency services anywhere in European airspace. Physical fitness remained a priority, though her training had shifted focus. Military aviation required pilots to handle extreme G-forces and combat stress. Civilian aviation required different endurance, the ability to maintain alertness and decision-making capacity during long flights and extended duty periods. She'd adjusted her exercise regimen accordingly, emphasizing cardiovascular endurance and mental stamina over pure physical strength. Her medical certifications went far beyond standard requirements. Most airline pilots maintained basic first aid credentials, but Fallon had earned advanced emergency medical training during her military service and kept those skills current. She could handle medical emergencies, traumatic injuries, and crisis situations that would overwhelm standard first aid protocols. It was preparation that seemed excessive for civilian aviation, but she'd learned that being over-prepared was never a disadvantage. Financial preparation had been equally thorough. Military pilots transitioning to civilian aviation often struggled with the economics of career change, reduced pay during training periods, expensive type ratings for specific aircraft, and the uncertainty of employment during the transition. Fallon had saved aggressively during her military career and researched every financial aspect of civilian aviation, ensuring she could survive extended periods of reduced income while building civilian credentials. Her network had been carefully cultivated during her transition. Military colleagues provided technical insights and training resources. Aviation professionals she'd met during NATO exercises offered advice about different airlines and regions. Former military pilots who'd successfully transitioned to civilian careers shared practical wisdom about managing the cultural shift between military and commercial aviation. But perhaps most importantly, she'd prepared psychologically for the challenges she knew she would face. Military aviation had taught her to compartmentalize stress, to maintain performance under pressure, and to make critical decisions with incomplete information. Civilian aviation would require different psychological skills: patience with bureaucracy, diplomacy with difficult passengers, and the ability to project calm authority even when others questioned her capabilities. She'd read extensively about aviation psychology, studying how passengers responded to crisis situations and how flight crews could maintain effectiveness during emergencies. She'd analyzed communication patterns during historical aviation emergencies, learning how successful crews had managed both technical problems and passenger panic simultaneously. Her personal gear reflected this comprehensive preparation. The carry-on bag stowed above seat 23C contained not just personal items, but emergency supplies that went well beyond standard travel necessities. Medical supplies for trauma situations, emergency communications equipment, and technical tools that might be needed if aircraft systems failed. It was equipment that raised no security concerns but could prove invaluable in situations where standard airline emergency provisions might be inadequate. Most tellingly, she'd spent dozens of hours studying the specific route that Flight 847 was flying, not because she'd planned to be on this particular flight, but because she'd studied every major commercial route in European airspace. She knew the weather patterns, the alternative airports, the air traffic control procedures, and the emergency protocols for every segment of European commercial aviation. What her interviewers at various airlines hadn't understood was that her military background hadn't made her unsuitable for civilian aviation. It had made her extraordinarily prepared for it. Every skill they thought she lacked, she'd developed through focused preparation. Every scenario they worried she couldn't handle, she'd practiced repeatedly until her responses became automatic. The question wasn't whether Fallon Martinez was ready for civilian aviation leadership. The question was whether civilian aviation was ready for someone who'd prepared as thoroughly as she had. The morning of Flight 847's departure had begun with yet another rejection, delivered with the same polite professionalism that had become depressingly familiar to Fallon over the past 3 months. The email from Air France had arrived just as she was finishing her pre-flight coffee and reviewing her notes for the British Airways interview scheduled for the following day. After careful consideration, the message read, "We have decided to pursue other candidates whose experience more closely aligns with our current operational needs." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what had become a predictable pattern: impressive credentials on paper, followed by in-person meetings that somehow revealed she wasn't quite what they were looking for. This particular rejection stung, Because the Air France interview had gone exceptionally well from a technical standpoint, she'd answered every systems question perfectly, demonstrated comprehensive knowledge of European airspace regulations, and even conducted a flawless simulation of an emergency approach into Charles de Gaulle during deteriorating weather conditions. The chief pilot had seemed impressed right up until the final handshake when he'd mentioned that they would be in touch soon. That phrase had become a death knell. In her military career, feedback had been direct and immediate. Performance was measurable, results were clear, and advancement was based on demonstrated competence under increasingly challenging conditions. But civilian aviation recruitment seemed to operate on subtleties and implications that had nothing to do with her ability to fly aircraft safely and efficiently. The frustration had been building for weeks. Each interview followed the same pattern: initial enthusiasm over her military credentials, technical questioning that she handled flawlessly, practical demonstrations where she consistently outperformed expectations, followed by vague promises and eventual polite rejections. The disconnect between her proven capabilities and the industry's response was becoming increasingly difficult to rationalize. Her savings were running low despite careful financial planning. The extended job search had stretched longer than anticipated, and London's cost of living was steadily eroding her transition fund. More concerning was the growing pressure from well-meaning family members who'd begun suggesting she return to military service or consider alternative career paths in aviation. Her sister Carmen had been particularly direct during their weekly video call 3 days earlier. "Maybe the airlines are trying to tell you something," she'd said with the blunt honesty that only siblings could deliver. "You've proven yourself in the military. Why not stay where you're appreciated instead of fighting for recognition somewhere else?" The suggestion had merit from a practical standpoint, but it felt like surrender. Military service had been fulfilling, but she'd reached a point where new challenges were necessary for continued growth. Commercial aviation represented a different kind of leadership, a chance to apply her skills in environments where success was measured by safety, efficiency, and passenger satisfaction, rather than tactical objectives. What made the rejections particularly galling was the knowledge that she was significantly more qualified than many pilots being hired by the same airlines. Through her network of military contacts who'd transitioned successfully to civilian aviation, she'd learned about recent hires at various carriers. Pilots with fewer flight hours, less diverse aircraft experience, and limited emergency training were being offered positions she was being denied. The gender factor was impossible to ignore, though it was rarely mentioned explicitly. Aviation remained male-dominated, and the subtle biases were pervasive, even when recruiters made conscious efforts to be fair. She'd watched male colleagues from her military service receive civilian offers after single interviews, while she was subjected to multiple rounds of evaluation for similar positions. Her physical appearance compounded the challenge. At 5'4", and with a naturally quiet demeanor, she didn't project the imposing presence that many recruiters associated with airline captains. It was ironic, considering that her most successful military operations had relied on precisely the same qualities that civilian recruiters found concerning: the ability to blend in, to make critical decisions without drawing unnecessary attention, to lead through competence rather than commanding physical presence. The psychological toll was becoming significant. For the first time since joining the military, she'd begun to question her own capabilities. Not her technical skills, which remained sharp, but her understanding of what civilian aviation actually required from its pilots. Perhaps there were aspects of commercial flying that her military background hadn't prepared her for. Perhaps the recruiters were seeing deficiencies that she couldn't recognize. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The problem wasn't her qualifications or her potential effectiveness as a commercial pilot. The problem was an industry that couldn't see past surface characteristics to evaluate actual capability. Every rejection reinforced the same message. Regardless of her skills, experience, or proven performance under pressure, she didn't look like what airlines wanted in their cockpits. The Flight 847 boarding process had provided a microcosm of these frustrations. As she'd settled into seat 23C, she'd overheard a conversation between two passengers discussing airline safety. One had mentioned preferring flights with experienced-looking captains, because it made him feel more confident about the flight. The comment had been innocent enough, but it highlighted the perception gap she was fighting against. Passengers wanted to feel safe, and their definition of safety was often tied to preconceived notions about leadership and authority. Airlines, in turn, were responding to passenger expectations rather than focusing solely on pilot competence. It was a cycle that perpetuated itself, making it increasingly difficult for pilots who didn't fit traditional molds to advance in civilian aviation. As Flight 847 had reached a cruising altitude, Fallon had tried to push aside her frustrations and focus on the interview she had scheduled for the next morning. British Airways was her last scheduled opportunity in London, and she'd prepared exhaustively for what felt like a final chance to prove herself in European commercial aviation. But the rejection from Air France had crystallized something that had been building for months. She was tired of proving herself to people who weren't qualified to evaluate her capabilities. She was tired of being polite and diplomatic while being systematically underestimated. Most of all, she was tired of accepting other people's limitations on what she could accomplish. At 11:47 a.m. local time, Flight 847 was 23 minutes from its scheduled arrival at London Heathrow when Captain Harrison keyed his microphone to begin the standard pre-landing announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, from the flight deck, we're beginning our initial descent into London Heathrow. Weather conditions are excellent with clear skies and light winds. We should have you on the ground right on schedule. The announcement was routine, delivered in the calm, professional tone that passengers expected from airline captains. Harrison had made similar announcements thousands of times during his career, and this morning felt no different from countless other transatlantic crossings. The Boeing 777 was performing perfectly. All systems were nominal, and the approach into Heathrow was proceeding exactly as planned. In the galley, senior flight attendant Marcus Webb was preparing the cabin for landing, working through the familiar checklist of securing service equipment and ensuring passenger compliance with safety regulations. The flight had been remarkably smooth. No turbulence, no medical emergencies, no difficult passengers. It was the kind of routine flight that crew members appreciated but rarely remembered afterward. First Officer Chun was updating the flight management system with current weather data from Heathrow when she noticed the first anomaly, a subtle change in engine noise that lasted barely 2 seconds before returning to normal. She glanced at the engine parameters on her display, but all readings appeared normal. Still, her training had taught her to investigate anything unusual, no matter how minor it seemed. "Mike, did you hear that engine noise change about 30 seconds ago?" she asked Captain Harrison, using his first name in the informal communication style common among experienced crews. Harrison nodded, having noticed the same thing. "I caught that too. All parameters look good, though. Probably just a momentary fluctuation in fuel flow." He performed a quick visual scan of the engine instruments, confirming that temperatures, pressures, and RPM readings were all within normal ranges. What neither pilot realized was that the momentary engine irregularity was the first symptom of a catastrophic failure developing deep within the aircraft's number 2 engine. A microscopic crack in a turbine blade, undetectable during routine inspections, had been growing gradually over hundreds of flight hours. The stress of sustained cruise operation had finally expanded the crack to a critical size. At 11:49 a.m., the crack became a complete fracture. The turbine blade separation happened in milliseconds, but its effects cascaded through multiple aircraft systems with devastating speed. The failed blade struck adjacent blades, creating a catastrophic unbalance that sent violent vibrations throughout the engine structure. Within seconds, the entire engine began tearing itself apart from the inside. The first indication in the cockpit was a violent shudder that seemed to shake the entire aircraft. Then came a series of warning lights and alarms that turned the quiet flight deck into chaos. Master caution lights illuminated, engine fire warnings activated, and the aircraft systems began reporting a cascade of failures. "Engine fire number 2, Chun called out, her voice sharp with adrenaline as she read the emergency displays. But before Harrison could respond, the situation became much worse. The engine separation was so violent that it severed critical hydraulic lines and electrical systems. The Boeing 777's redundant safety systems were designed to handle single-point failures, but the catastrophic nature of this engine failure was damaging multiple systems simultaneously. Within 30 seconds, the aircraft had lost primary flight controls, backup hydraulic power, and several crucial avionics systems. Harrison fought the controls as the aircraft began an uncommanded roll to the right. The fly-by-wire system that normally made the 7-7 stable and predictable was failing, leaving the pilots with limited manual control over a machine that suddenly wanted to tear itself apart in the sky. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," Harrison transmitted on the emergency frequency, his voice professional despite the crisis. "British Airways 847. We have multiple engine failure and system malfunctions, requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport and emergency services standing by." The response from London Control was immediate, but couldn't address the fundamental problem. Flight 847 was 23 minutes from Heathrow with 284 souls on board, and the aircraft was rapidly becoming unflyable. In the passenger cabin, the violent shaking and sudden altitude changes had triggered panic. Oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments as the aircraft's damaged systems responded to what they interpreted as a rapid decompression event. Passengers screamed as luggage fell from overhead bins, and the aircraft pitched and rolled in ways that passenger jets were never supposed to move. Most of the passengers were terrified but helpless, strapping themselves into their seats and following the flight attendants' shouted instructions to prepare for emergency procedures. But in seat 23C, Fallon Martinez was making calculations that had nothing to do with passenger safety briefings. Her trained ear had recognized the specific sound signature of the engine failure, not just mechanical damage, but the kind of catastrophic separation that could compromise multiple aircraft systems. Her eyes tracked the aircraft's unusual movements, identifying control responses that suggested hydraulic failure and possible flight control system damage. While other passengers prayed or panicked, Fallon was mentally reviewing emergency procedures for exactly this type of failure scenario. She'd studied them not as theoretical exercises, but as practical problems she might someday need to solve. That study was about to become critically relevant because in the cockpit, Captain Harrison and First Officer Chun were discovering that their aircraft was beyond the scope of standard emergency procedures. "Sarah, I can't control the pitch," Harrison said through gritted teeth, fighting to keep the aircraft level as it wanted to nose down into an increasingly steep descent. "The elevators aren't responding properly, and we're losing hydraulic pressure in all three systems." Chun was working frantically through emergency checklists, but the combination of failures they were facing wasn't covered by any single procedure. Multiple systems were failing faster than they could respond to individual problems, and the aircraft was becoming increasingly unstable with each passing second. In 2 minutes, they would make a decision that would change everything. But first, they had to acknowledge something that no airline captain ever wants to admit. They were in a situation beyond their training, experience, and available resources to handle. Flight 847 was going down, and everyone on board was about to discover what passenger 127 could do when the impossible became the only option for survival. In the cockpit of Flight 847, Captain Harrison and First Officer Chun were working through emergency procedures with the desperate efficiency of professionals who understood that they were running out of options. The aircraft continued its erratic descent, altitude bleeding away at nearly 3,000 feet per minute, despite their attempts to arrest the dive. "Sarah, try the backup hydraulic system," Harrison commanded, his hands locked on the control yoke in a battle against physics that he was steadily losing. The Boeing 777 had been designed with triple redundancy in critical systems, but the catastrophic engine failure had damaged components that the engineers had never imagined failing simultaneously. Chun's fingers flew across the emergency panel, activating backup systems and attempting to isolate damaged components. "Backup hydraulics are showing pressure, but I'm not getting any response from the flight controls," she reported, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Primary and secondary systems are completely offline." The radio crackled with urgent transmissions from London Control, coordinating emergency response and attempting to provide assistance that the pilots couldn't use. "British Airways 847, London Control. We're vectoring all traffic away from your position and have emergency services standing by at Heathrow. What is your current flight condition?" Harrison keyed his microphone while fighting to keep the aircraft from entering an unrecoverable dive. London Control, we have complete hydraulic failure and minimal flight control authority. Aircraft is descending through flight level 270, and we cannot arrest the descent. Request immediate clearance to any available airport. But even as he made the request, both pilots knew that reaching any airport was becoming increasingly unlikely. The aircraft's descent rate was accelerating, and their control inputs were having less and less effect on the flight path. Standard emergency procedures assume that pilots would retain some level of control over their aircraft, but Flight 847 was operating beyond the parameters of standard procedures. Try manual reversion, Chun suggested, referring to a backup system that would give them direct mechanical control over some flight surfaces. It was a desperate measure, typically reserved for situations where all electronic flight control systems had failed, but their current situation was exactly that desperate. Harrison attempted to engage manual reversion, but the system didn't respond. The engine separation had apparently damaged the mechanical linkages, as well as the hydraulic and electronic systems. They were flying a 300-ton aircraft with virtually no ability to control its flight path, and the ground was approaching at an alarming rate 20 miles away. The two F-22 Raptors that had been conducting training exercises were receiving increasingly urgent communications from RAF control. Squadron Leader Morrison and Flight Lieutenant Torres had been monitoring the emergency on guard frequency, but their training mission had suddenly become a potential combat air patrol situation. Falcon Lead, this is RAF control, came the transmission. Be advised that British Airways 847 is in emergency descent with reported multiple system failures. We're tasking you to provide visual reconnaissance and relay information to emergency services. Morrison acknowledged the transmission and banked his F-22 toward the coordinates provided by radar control. As a fighter pilot, he was trained for air-to-air combat and tactical strikes, not civilian aircraft emergencies, but his orders were clear. Get close enough to assess the situation and provide real-time information to ground-based emergency coordinators. Falcon 2, form up on me, Morrison commanded his wingman. We're going to take a look at this airliner and see what we can determine about their condition. As the Raptors accelerated toward Flight 847's position, Torres was already questioning what they could actually accomplish. Fighter jets were designed for speed and maneuverability, not for providing assistance to damaged civilian aircraft. They could observe and report, but they couldn't physically help with the emergency that was unfolding at flight level 240. Back on Flight 847, the passenger cabin had descended into barely controlled chaos. Flight attendants were shouting instructions about brace positions, while passengers struggled with oxygen masks and tried to secure loose items that had become projectiles during the aircraft's violent movements. The normal sounds of commercial flight, conversation, entertainment systems, service activities, had been replaced by emergency lighting, alarm bells, and the terrified prayers of people who understood they might be living through their final minutes. Marcus Webb, the senior flight attendant, was attempting to coordinate emergency preparations while dealing with his own fear about their deteriorating situation. He'd been trained for various emergency scenarios, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the combination of system failures that seemed to be affecting every aspect of the aircraft's operation. Ladies and gentlemen, please ensure your seat belts are fastened tightly and review the safety card in your seat pocket, Webb announced over the cabin address system, his voice professionally calm despite the circumstances. But even as he spoke, he could see passengers looking toward the cockpit with expressions that made it clear they understood the gravity of their situation. In seat 23C, Fallon had been monitoring the cockpit communications on the emergency frequency using a small radio receiver she carried for situational awareness during flights. What she was hearing confirmed her worst fears about their condition. The pilots were reporting system failures that, in combination, made controlled flight nearly impossible. She looked around the cabin at the panicked passengers and overwhelmed flight crew, then made a decision that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew her as passenger 127. Rising from her seat, she began making her way forward toward the cockpit, moving with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. The aircraft lurched violently to the left as she moved through the cabin, but her balance remained perfect. The reflexive stability of someone accustomed to maintaining equilibrium in unstable aircraft under combat conditions. Other passengers noticed her movement and wondered why she seemed so calm when everyone else was terrified. As she approached the cockpit door, Marcus Webb intercepted her with the professional authority of a senior flight attendant dealing with a passenger who was clearly not following emergency protocols. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat immediately," Webb said, his voice carrying the kind of firm politeness that flight attendants use to manage difficult situations. "We're in an emergency situation, and all passengers must remain seated with their seatbelts fastened." Fallon looked at Webb with calm eyes that seemed completely out of place in the chaos surrounding them. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that made him pause, even though he didn't understand why. "I need to speak with the captain immediately," she said, her tone suggesting that this wasn't a request subject to negotiation. "I'm a military pilot with experience in aircraft emergency situations, and I may be able to help." Webb's first instinct was to refuse and escort her back to her seat, but something in her demeanor made him hesitate. She wasn't displaying the panic or desperation of other passengers. Instead, she projected the kind of calm competence that he associated with crew members rather than passengers. Before he could respond, the aircraft pitched forward into a steeper dive, and alarms began sounding throughout the cabin. In the cockpit, Captain Harrison and First Officer Chun were facing the reality that conventional solutions were not going to save Flight 847. Time was running out, and everyone on board was about to learn whether passenger 127 really could do what no one had imagined possible. Fallon didn't wait for Marcus Webb's permission. As the aircraft shuddered through another violent pitch change, she moved past the flight attendant with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to navigating unstable platforms under extreme conditions. Webb, still processing her claim of being a military pilot, found himself following rather than stopping her. The cockpit door was locked according to post-9/11 security protocols, but Webb's master key opened it to reveal Captain Harrison and First Officer Chun in the middle of what appeared to be a losing battle with their aircraft. Both pilots were focused entirely on their instruments and controls, sweat visible on their faces despite the cool cabin temperature. "Captain Harrison," Fallon announced herself, her voice cutting through the cacophony of alarms and radio chatter. "I'm Major Fallon Martinez, Spanish Air Force. I have extensive experience with multi-system aircraft failures, and I believe I can assist with your current emergency." Harrison's initial reaction was disbelief mixed with irritation. He was dealing with the most serious emergency of his career, and the last thing he needed was a passenger claiming she could help. But something in her tone, the calm authority and precise terminology, made him glance away from his instruments for a split second. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but this is not the time for—" "Captain, you're dealing with catastrophic hydraulic failure combined with flight control system damage," Fallon interrupted, her voice remaining steady as she assessed the cockpit displays over his shoulder. "Your primary concern right now is preventing the aircraft from entering an unrecoverable dive while maintaining enough airspeed to reach a suitable landing site." Chun looked up from her emergency checklist, surprised by the technical accuracy of the passenger's assessment. "How do you know our system status?" "Because I've been monitoring your radio communications, and I can read your instrument displays," Fallon replied matter-of-factly. "More importantly, I've trained extensively for exactly this type of emergency. You're attempting to use standard Boeing emergency procedures, but this failure combination requires manual flight techniques that aren't covered in civilian training programs." Harrison was about to dismiss her again when the aircraft pitched into an even steeper dive, forcing him to use both hands and significant physical strength just to prevent a complete loss of control. The standard recovery techniques weren't working, and his options were rapidly diminishing. "What manual flight techniques?" Chun asked, desperation creeping into her professional composure. Fallon moved closer to the center console, her eyes scanning the flight instruments with the practiced efficiency of someone who could read aircraft systems as easily as most people read books. "You're fighting the aircraft instead of working with it. In a situation like this, you need to use differential thrust combined with rudder inputs to maintain directional control while using elevator trim to manage pitch attitude instead of trying to force the controls." "Differential thrust?" Harrison questioned, even as part of his mind recognized the logic of what she was suggesting. Your remaining engine can provide both forward thrust and directional control if you modulate the power correctly, Fallon explained, her hands moving to indicate the throttle controls without actually touching them. Combined with careful rudder inputs, you can essentially fly the aircraft like a large fighter jet with compromised controls. I've done it before, just not in a civilian aircraft this size. Outside the cockpit windows, the English countryside was becoming visibly larger as Flight 847 continued its descent through 18,000 feet. Time was running out for theoretical discussions, and Harrison realized that his conventional training had reached its limits. "You've actually recovered from this type of failure?" he asked, his desperation finally overcoming his skepticism. "Multiple times in various aircraft types," Fallon confirmed. "The principles are the same regardless of the aircraft size. You're trying to use flight controls that aren't responding properly. Instead, you need to use the systems that are still functional, engine power, rudder authority, and trim controls, to maintain aircraft attitude and heading." Chun was studying her emergency displays with new understanding. "The trim system is still partially responsive. We hadn't tried using it as a primary flight control because civilian emergency procedures assume you'll maintain primary flight control authority. Military procedures assume you won't, because combat damage often eliminates multiple systems simultaneously," Fallon said. "You need to treat this as a combat damage scenario, not a standard commercial aviation emergency." The radio crackled with another transmission from London Control. "British Airways 847, be advised you are now through flight level 150 and descending rapidly. What is your current control status?" Harrison looked at Fallon, his expression shifting from skepticism to desperate hope. "Can you actually help us regain control of this aircraft?" "I can try," she replied, her confidence evident but not overconfident. "But I'll need access to the controls, and you'll need to trust techniques that aren't in your standard operating procedures." Harrison and Chun exchanged glances, two experienced pilots facing a decision that went against everything they'd been trained about cockpit resource management and chain of command. But their aircraft was dying around them, and conventional solutions had already failed. "What do you need?" Harrison asked. Fallon moved to the left side of the cockpit, positioning herself where she could reach the throttle controls and trim system. "I need you to maintain rudder pressure while I work the power settings. Chun, I need you to call out altitude and airspeed while monitoring system status. We're going to attempt a power-on approach using differential thrust for primary directional control." As she placed her hands on the controls, Fallon felt the familiar sensation of an aircraft in distress, the subtle vibrations and erratic responses that indicated damaged systems and compromised flight characteristics. But she also felt something else, the potential for recovery that Harrison and Chun hadn't been able to detect. The Boeing 777 was badly damaged, but it wasn't completely uncontrollable. It just required techniques that civilian pilots were never taught, methods developed through military experience with aircraft that had been shot up, damaged, or pushed beyond their design limitations. "Ready?" she asked, her voice calm, despite the fact that she was about to attempt a recovery technique that had never been tried on a civilian airliner of this size. Harrison and Chun nodded, their skepticism replaced by the desperate hope of professionals who understood they were out of conventional options. Outside, the F-22 Raptors were approaching Flight 847's position, their pilots having no idea that the most critical part of the emergency was just beginning. Just as Fallon positioned herself at the controls, the cockpit door burst open again. This time, it wasn't Marcus Webb. Captain Reynolds, the British Airways Czech airman who had been traveling as a passenger in first class, entered. Reynolds was a senior training captain with over 15,000 hours of experience, and he'd made his way to the cockpit as soon as he understood the severity of the emergency. "Harrison, what's the situation?" Reynolds demanded, his eyes immediately taking in the instrument displays before noticing Fallon at the throttle controls. His expression shifted from concern to alarm. "Who is this passenger, and why does she have access to the flight controls?" "Captain Reynolds, this is Major Martinez," Harrison replied quickly, not taking his hands off the yoke as the aircraft continued its unstable descent. "She's a military pilot, and she believes she can help us regain control." Reynolds moved immediately to Fallon's position, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a senior captain dealing with an unacceptable breach of protocol. Major or not, she's a passenger on this aircraft and has no authority to operate these controls. Ma'am, please return to your seat immediately. Fallon looked at Reynolds calmly, recognizing the type immediately. An experienced airline pilot whose expertise was genuine, but whose thinking was constrained by civilian aviation protocols. Captain, this aircraft is in an unrecoverable descent using standard emergency procedures. I have experience with exactly this type of system failure combination. I don't care what experience you think you have, Reynolds replied sharply. These are civilian flight controls being operated under British Airways authority, and no passenger is authorized to touch them under any circumstances. Harrison, get her away from those controls immediately. The tension in the cockpit was becoming as critical as the flight emergency itself. First Officer Chun looked between the three pilots, understanding that they were wasting precious seconds arguing about authority while their aircraft continued to fall toward the earth. Captain Reynolds, Chun interjected desperately, our standard procedures aren't working. We've lost hydraulic and flight control authority, and we're running out of altitude. Maybe we should listen to what she's suggesting. Absolutely not, Reynolds responded with the finality of someone accustomed to making command decisions. I don't care if she claims to be a military pilot. This is a civilian aircraft operating under commercial aviation regulations, and passengers do not operate flight controls under any circumstances. Period. Harrison felt the aircraft lurch into another uncommanded roll, forcing him to use all his strength just to maintain wings-level flight. Captain, with respect, nothing we've tried is working. We're going to lose this aircraft if we don't try something different. What we're going to try is proper emergency procedures executed by qualified airline pilots, Reynolds declared, moving to displace Fallon from the throttle controls. Ma'am, step away from those controls immediately, or I will have you physically removed from this cockpit. The radio crackled with another urgent transmission from London Control. British Airways 847, you are now descending through 12,000 feet and approaching minimum safe altitude for your current position. Do you require immediate emergency vectors to the nearest available airport? Fallon stepped back from the controls, but her expression remained calm despite the rejection of her assistants. She'd encountered similar institutional resistance throughout her military career, the automatic assumption that established procedures were always superior to unconventional solutions, regardless of circumstances. Captain Reynolds, she said quietly, in approximately 2 minutes, this aircraft will reach an altitude where recovery becomes impossible, regardless of the technique used. Standard procedures assume you have flight control authority that you currently do not possess. I've been flying for 27 years, Reynolds replied curtly, settling into position at the throttle controls. I think I understand aircraft emergency procedures better than a passenger who claims to have military experience. Harrison watched in growing desperation as Reynolds began implementing standard emergency procedures that had already proven ineffective. The senior captain was methodically working through his emergency checklist, attempting to restore hydraulic pressure and flight control authority using techniques that Chun had already tried without success. Sir, we've already attempted those procedures, Chun reported, her voice tight with controlled panic. The backup systems aren't responding, and we're not getting any authority from the flight controls. Then we'll try them again properly this time, Reynolds responded, his confidence unshaken, despite the evidence that conventional approaches were failing. He was a product of a system that valued adherence to established procedures above improvisation, even when those procedures were proving inadequate. Marcus Webb, who had remained in the cockpit doorway, watched the interaction with growing alarm. As a senior flight attendant, he'd seen enough emergency situations to recognize when standard responses weren't working. The passenger who claimed to be a military pilot had projected more confidence and technical competence than he'd seen from the pilots who were officially in command. Shouldn't we at least listen to what she has to suggest? Webb asked quietly, though his question was immediately dismissed by Reynolds. Flight attendants and passengers do not make operational decisions on commercial aircraft, Reynolds stated firmly. We follow established emergency procedures, not improvised techniques suggested by unauthorized personnel. Outside the cockpit windows, the ground was becoming clearly visible as Flight 847 continued its descent through 10,000 feet. The aircraft's erratic flight path was becoming more pronounced, with increasingly violent pitch and roll movements That indicated the pilots were losing what little control they had managed to maintain. In the passenger cabin, travelers were beginning to understand that their emergency was beyond the scope of routine aviation incidents. The professional calm of the flight attendants was giving way to barely controlled urgency, and the aircraft's movements were becoming violent enough to cause injuries among passengers who hadn't properly secured themselves. Fallon remained in the cockpit, watching as Reynolds implemented procedures she knew wouldn't work, while precious altitude and time evaporated with each passing second. She'd offered her expertise and been categorically rejected, not based on an evaluation of her qualifications or the merit of her suggestions, but simply because she was classified as a passenger rather than crew. It was the same institutional bias she'd fought throughout her career transition, but now the consequences weren't limited to her own professional advancement. 284 lives were at stake, and they were being put at risk by the same rigid thinking that had kept her out of civilian cockpits for months. As the aircraft descended through 1,000 feet, with less than 3 minutes remaining before recovery became impossible, everyone in the cockpit was about to discover whether established procedures were sufficient to handle an unprecedented emergency or whether expertise should be valued regardless of its source. At 7,000 feet above the English countryside, with the aircraft's descent rate approaching 4,000 feet per minute, Captain Reynolds finally acknowledged what Harrison and Chun had recognized minutes earlier. Standard emergency procedures were not sufficient for their current situation. His systematic approach to restoring hydraulic authority had failed completely, and the Boeing 777 continued its uncontrolled descent toward terrain that was becoming frighteningly detailed through the cockpit windows. "London Control, British Airways 847, Reynolds transmitted, his voice maintaining professional composure despite the desperation of their situation. "We are unable to arrest our descent using standard procedures. Request immediate emergency services at the nearest available airport and clearance of all air traffic from our projected flight path." The response from air traffic control carried the controlled urgency of professionals who understood they were coordinating what might become a mass casualty event. British Airways 847 understood. "We have emergency services mobilizing at multiple locations, and all traffic is being diverted from your area. Be advised that RAF Coningsby is your closest suitable runway, bearing 090 degrees from your current position, distance approximately 15 nautical miles. 15 nautical miles. At their current descent rate and forward speed, they had perhaps 4 minutes to regain control of their aircraft and execute an approach that would require precision they no longer possessed. The mathematics of their situation were becoming impossible to ignore." First Officer Chun looked up from her instruments with an expression that conveyed everything Harrison needed to know about their remaining options. "Captain, I'm showing less than 3 minutes before we reach minimum recovery altitude. If we don't regain control authority immediately, we won't be able to attempt any landing approach." Reynolds continued working the controls with increasing desperation, his methodical approach giving way to the kind of frantic manipulation that experienced pilots recognize as the precursor to complete loss of control. Sweat was visible on his forehead, despite the cool cockpit temperature, and his breathing had become audibly labored. Fallon remained positioned near the cockpit door, watching the systematic failure of conventional approaches while calculating trajectories and options that the airline pilots couldn't see. Her military training had taught her to think beyond standard procedures when standard procedures proved inadequate, but she'd been explicitly ordered not to interfere with the airline crew's handling of their emergency. Harrison, fighting to maintain wings-level flight with controls that responded unpredictably when they responded at all, finally reached the decision point that every pilot hopes never to face. His aircraft was beyond the scope of his training and experience. Conventional procedures had failed, and time was running out for any solution that might save the lives of everyone on board. "Captain Reynolds," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a command decision that transcended normal hierarchy, "I'm going to ask Major Martinez to assist us. We're out of conventional options, and she's offered techniques that might work where ours haven't." Reynolds looked at Harrison with the expression of a senior pilot whose authority was being directly challenged by a subordinate. "Absolutely not. We do not turn control of commercial aircraft over to unauthorized personnel, regardless of circumstances. That's not how civilian aviation operates." "Sir, with respect," Chun interjected, her voice tight with the stress of watching their altitude continue to decrease. How civilian aviation operates isn't working right now. We're going to crash if we don't try something different. And she's the only person in this cockpit who's claimed experience with this type of failure. The radio crackled with a new transmission, this time from the F-22 Raptors that had finally reached visual contact with Flight 847. British Airways 847, this is RAF Falcon Lead. We have visual contact with your aircraft and can confirm you appear to be in an unstable descent. We're standing by to provide any assistance within our capabilities. Squadron Leader Morrison's transmission carried the professional concern of a military pilot who understood aircraft emergencies, but his F-22 was designed for air superiority missions, not civilian aircraft assistance. He could observe and report, but he couldn't physically help the airliner that was clearly in distress below him. Harrison keyed his microphone to respond to the fighter escort. Falcon Lead, British Airways 847. We have multiple system failures and limited control authority. We're attempting an emergency approach to RAF Coningsby, but may not be able to maintain controlled flight for much longer. What happened next would be remembered by everyone in that cockpit for the rest of their lives. As Harrison released his microphone key, Fallon stepped forward with the quiet confidence of someone who had made an irreversible decision. "Captain Harrison, Captain Reynolds," she said, her voice carrying absolute calm despite the chaos surrounding them. "I'm going to help you save this aircraft and everyone on board. You can accept my assistance and possibly survive this emergency, or you can maintain protocol and almost certainly crash. But I'm not going to watch 284 people die because of institutional resistance to unconventional solutions." Without waiting for permission, she moved to the throttle controls, her hands finding their positions with the unconscious precision of thousands of hours of flight experience. "Captain Harrison, I need you to maintain rudder pressure and call out altitude. Chun, monitor our airspeed and engine parameters. Reynolds, you can either help us or get out of the way. But this aircraft is not crashing today." The authority in her voice was unmistakable. Not the desperation of a passenger trying to help, but the command presence of a pilot who had faced life-and-death situations before and knew exactly what needed to be done. For the first time since the emergency began, someone in the cockpit was projecting absolute confidence that recovery was possible. Reynolds started to object, but Harrison cut him off with the decisive tone of a captain taking command of his own aircraft. "Major Martinez, you have control of power settings. Show us what you can do." Outside, Squadron Leader Morrison was about to witness something that no military pilot had ever seen before: a civilian airliner being recovered from uncontrolled flight using combat flying techniques by someone whose call sign he would soon learn to respect above all others. The impossible was about to become possible, and Passenger 127 was about to show everyone exactly why the F-22 pilots would stand in salute when they learned her true identity. The moment Fallon's hands touched the throttle controls, she felt the familiar sensation of an aircraft fighting for its life. The Boeing 777's remaining engine was producing normal power, but the aircraft's damaged flight control systems were translating that power into erratic thrust vectors that made controlled flight nearly impossible. She had perhaps 90 seconds to demonstrate that her combat aviation techniques could work on a civilian airliner, or everyone on board would die. "Captain Harrison, reduce rudder pressure by half and hold steady," she commanded, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a pilot who had recovered damaged aircraft before. "Chun, I need continuous altitude and airspeed callouts. We're going to use differential power settings to control our flight path instead of relying on damaged flight controls." Harrison felt the aircraft's response change almost immediately as Fallon began modulating the throttle with microscopic precision. Instead of the violent, uncontrolled movements they'd been experiencing, the Boeing began responding to inputs in ways that seemed impossible given their system failures. 6,000 feet, airspeed 280 knots, and decreasing, Chun called out, her voice tight with concentration as she monitored their descent parameters. The aircraft was still falling rapidly, but its flight path was becoming more predictable under Fallon's control. What Fallon was doing defied everything that civilian aviation training taught about engine management. She was using rapid, subtle changes in power output to create differential thrust that functioned like rudder control while simultaneously using the aircraft's trim system to manage pitch attitude in ways that Boeing's designers had never intended. "How are you controlling our heading?" Reynolds demanded, his skepticism warring with the evidence of his own eyes. The aircraft was responding to Fallon's inputs more effectively than it had to any of their conventional control attempts. "Combat damage control techniques," Fallon replied without taking her eyes off the engine instruments. "When you lose primary flight controls, you use whatever systems are still functional. Engine power can provide directional control if you modulate it correctly, and trim systems can substitute for elevator authority if you understand the aircraft's center of gravity dynamics." Outside, Squadron Leader Morrison was watching Flight 847's flight path with growing amazement. The civilian airliner had been in an uncontrolled descent when the F-22s had first made visual contact, but now it was following a more stable trajectory that suggested someone had regained at least partial control of the aircraft. "Falcon 2, are you seeing this?" Morrison transmitted to his wingman. "That airliner appears to be under control despite their reported system failures." Flight Lieutenant Torres confirmed the observation from her position off Morrison's right wing. "Confirmed lead. Their flight path has stabilized significantly in the past 60 seconds. Whatever they're doing in that cockpit, it's working." Inside Flight 847's cockpit, Fallon was fighting a battle that combined physics, engineering, and years of experience with aircraft that had been pushed far beyond their design limitations. Every input had to be precise because the margin for error was essentially zero. Too much power, and the aircraft would enter an uncontrolled roll. Too little power, and they would resume their fatal descent. 5,000 feet, airspeed 260 knots, Chun reported, her voice carrying the first hint of hope she'd felt since the emergency began. "Rate of descent is decreasing. We're actually climbing slightly. Harrison, I need you to contact RAF Coningsby and tell them we're going to attempt a straight-in approach to their longest runway," Fallon said, her hands never pausing in their constant adjustments to the power settings. "We won't be able to execute a standard approach pattern, but I can get us lined up for a direct approach if they can clear the airspace." Harrison keyed his microphone with growing confidence in Fallon's abilities. "RAF Coningsby Tower, British Airways 847. We have regained partial flight control and are requesting immediate straight-in approach to your longest runway. We will not be able to execute standard approach procedures." The response from RAF Coningsby was immediate. "British Airways 847 cleared straight-in approach to runway 25. Length is 3,048 meters. Emergency services are standing by. Be advised that approach path is clear of all traffic." As Flight 847 continued its unconventional approach, Fallon was managing challenges that would have been impossible for pilots trained only in civilian procedures. The aircraft's damaged systems required constant attention, and any momentary lapse in concentration could result in immediate loss of control. 4,000 feet, airspeed holding at 250 knots, Chun called out. "Fallon, how are you maintaining such precise control with only engine power?" "Years of practice with aircraft that were shot up over hostile territory," Fallon replied matter-of-factly. "When you're trying to get a damaged fighter back to base, you learn to use every system that still functions. The principles scale up to larger aircraft." In the passenger cabin, the violent movements that had terrified everyone for the past 10 minutes were giving way to something that felt more like controlled flight. People were still frightened, but the sense of imminent death was being replaced by cautious hope that they might actually survive their ordeal. Marcus Webb, monitoring the situation from the cockpit doorway, was watching a display of flying skill unlike anything he'd seen in 15 years of commercial aviation. The woman who had been just another passenger 20 minutes earlier was controlling their aircraft with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. 3,000 feet, runway in sight, Chun announced, her voice carrying unmistakable relief. Through the cockpit windows, RAF Coningsby's runway was visible ahead, lined with emergency vehicles and surrounded by the kind of emergency response that indicated everyone on the ground understood the gravity of their situation. Reynolds, who had been forced to acknowledge that his conventional approach had failed completely, was watching Fallon's technique with the fascination of a professional pilot seeing something entirely new. "Major Martinez, I owe you an apology. What you're doing, shouldn't it be possible with our current system failures?" "It's only possible because I had instructors who taught me that impossible usually just means not covered in the manual," Fallon replied, her concentration never wavering as she guided the damaged Boeing toward what would either be a successful emergency landing or a catastrophic crash that would be analyzed by accident investigators for years to come. At 2,000 feet above RAF Coningsby, with emergency vehicles tracking their approach and F-22 Raptors providing escort, Flight 847 was about to complete an approach that would redefine what civilian aviation considered possible in emergency situations. Flight 847 touched down on RAF Coningsby's runway 25 with a gentleness that defied every expectation of an aircraft that had lost primary flight controls at 35,000 feet. The landing was so smooth that passengers initially wondered if they were still airborne, until the sound of reverse thrust and the sight of emergency vehicles racing alongside confirmed that they were safely on the ground. In the cockpit, the silence that followed touchdown was profound. Captain Harrison sat with his hands still on controls that had been useless for the past 20 minutes, staring at instruments that showed normal readings for the first time since their emergency began. First Officer Chun was shaking slightly as the adrenaline of their ordeal finally caught up with her, while Captain Reynolds sat in stunned silence, processing what he had just witnessed. "Ladies and gentlemen, from the flight deck," Fallon announced over the cabin address system, her voice carrying the calm professionalism of someone for whom impossible recoveries were just another day's work. "Welcome to RAF Coningsby. We will be remaining on the aircraft until emergency personnel can ensure that all systems are secure and assist with your deplaning." The passenger cabin erupted in applause and cheers that could be heard throughout the aircraft. People were crying, laughing, and embracing strangers as the reality of their survival settled in. Marcus Webb moved through the cabin, checking on passengers and marveling at the fact that they had just experienced what would certainly be remembered as one of aviation's most remarkable emergency recoveries. Outside, Squadron Leader Morrison was coordinating with RAF Control to ensure that Flight 847 could taxi safely to a secure parking area. But his mind was processing something that would reshape his understanding of what was possible in aviation emergency situations. "RAF Control, Falcon led," he transmitted. "British Airways 847 has landed successfully. The approach and landing were executed flawlessly using techniques I've never seen applied to civilian aircraft, which request information about the pilot who executed this recovery." The response from RAF Control came after a brief pause. "Falcon Lead, stand by for that information. We're coordinating with British Airways for pilot identification." As Flight 847 taxied slowly toward the terminal, followed by a procession of emergency vehicles that were no longer needed for a crash response, Harrison finally found his voice. "Major Martinez, what you just accomplished was beyond anything I've seen in 23 years of flying. How do we even begin to thank you?" Fallon was securing the throttle controls and shutting down systems with the same methodical precision she'd used throughout the emergency. "You don't need to thank me, Captain. You just need to remember that expertise comes from many different sources, and sometimes the person who can save your life might not look like what you expected." Captain Reynolds, who had opposed her assistance based on rigid adherence to protocol, was struggling with the implications of what had just occurred. "Major, I owe you more than an apology. My insistence on following standard procedures nearly cost us everyone on this aircraft." "Standard procedures exist for good reasons," Fallon replied diplomatically. "But emergency situations sometimes require solutions that go beyond the manual. The key is recognizing when conventional approaches aren't sufficient and being willing to try alternatives." As the aircraft came to a complete stop, RAF personnel began coordinating the deplaning process while investigators prepared to examine the aircraft and interview crew members about the unprecedented recovery. But the most significant moment was yet to come. Squadron Leader Morrison had landed his F-22 and was walking across the tarmac toward Flight 847 when he received the information he had requested from RAF Control. "Morrison, you need to hear this," Torres said, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and recognition. "The pilot who just saved that aircraft, her call sign is Phoenix. She's the same pilot who completed that classified Mediterranean operation last year when her aircraft was shot up and she still managed to complete the mission." Morrison stopped walking, his expression shifting from professional interest to something approaching reverence. Major Fallon Martinez, call sign Phoenix, was a legend in NATO aviation circles. Her reputation for completing impossible missions under extraordinary circumstances was known throughout the European military aviation community. "Phoenix is on that civilian aircraft?" Morrison asked, hardly believing that one of NATO's most decorated combat pilots had been flying as a passenger on a commercial flight. As Fallon emerged from the aircraft, still wearing civilian clothes, but now carrying herself with the unmistakable bearing of a pilot who had just accomplished something extraordinary, Morrison and Torres snapped to attention in a salute that would become one of the most photographed moments in aviation history. Other RAF personnel, learning of her identity and her role in the emergency recovery, joined the salute. Within minutes, dozens of military aviation professionals were standing at attention on the RAF Koningsby tarmac, honoring a pilot whose skills had just redefined what was possible in civilian aviation emergency situations. The passengers of Flight 847, deplaning slowly and looking back at the aircraft that had brought them safely through an impossible situation, gradually understood that they had been saved by someone whose expertise far exceeded anything they could have imagined. The quiet woman in seat 23C, who had seemed unremarkable during the routine flight, was being saluted by fighter pilots whose respect was earned through achievements that most people would never know existed. In the weeks that followed, Major Fallon Martinez would receive offers from every major airline in Europe and North America. Her demonstration of emergency flying techniques would become required study material in both military and civilian flight training programs. The rigid protocols that had initially excluded her from civilian aviation would be revised to recognize that exceptional capability could come from unexpected sources. But in that moment on the tarmac at RAF Koningsby, as F-22 pilots held their salute and passengers realized they had been saved by someone whose qualifications exceeded their wildest expectations, the transformation was complete. She was no longer just passenger 127. She was Phoenix, the pilot who had proven that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage of all. The airlines that had rejected her applications would spend the following months trying to understand how they had failed to recognize the capabilities of someone who had just accomplished what aviation experts would later describe as the most remarkable emergency recovery in civilian aviation history. 6 months later, Captain Fallon Martinez would be flying wide-body aircraft for British Airways, leading emergency response training programs and mentoring pilots who would never again assume that size, appearance, or background determined capability. But that's another story entirely.